Today, we are honored to be joined by an incredible man who has so much information to share with us. He has, really experienced the pain that he's experienced so much pain with his trauma, and he's been able to get through onto the other side. So, Larry, welcome to the show. We are so happy to have you with us today and to talk about your journey and your book. And this is quite a story. So I'd love to give our listeners, a bit of perspective on your journey. So from your mouth.
Sure. So the memoir is the result of 40 plus year journey
Yes.
to understand my father's suicide. My father was a very respected physician here in Denver, Colorado. He had immigrated from Eastern Europe when he was 3 years old, grew up in Newark, and he came out here to join an older brother who started a medical practice. Anyway, the spring of 1966, which I know is a long time ago now, my family was very active in planning for my bar mitzvah. And a couple of weeks before the bar mitzvah, my parents came to me and kind of said to the effect, "How would I feel, Larry? How would you feel if we postponed the bar mitzvah?" The family, we were not going to go into details, but the family's going through some things. And I said, I don't care. Anyway, my mom kind of made the executive decision to push through it. And so we did the bar mitzvah, and at the end of the actual ceremony, the bar mitzvah boy, who's now anointed a man, at least in the eyes of the religion, always turns around, sees his father on the podium, and goes over there and gets like a warm embrace of congratulations or kiss or whatever, right? And I turned around, and my dad had this expression on his face, which at the time I interpreted as his disappointment, that perhaps somehow I had made a mistake or failed him somehow. And when I approached him, he gave me the most tentative hug, and I just couldn't understand it. And so I kind of ignored each other the rest of the day. And then the next day, there was a brunch at my parents' best friend's. And they had 5 kids. I have an older sister, younger brother. So all of these kids were sent outside because the grown-ups had to talk. And unbeknownst to me at the time, the parents were talking about how to treat my dad's serious depression. And it was decided that he would be hospitalized in Denver, which was kind of a new thing. And my siblings and I had no idea what was going on. So he actually checked into the hospital. There's a psych hospital. 2 days after my bar mitzvah, we were sent to school and told not to talk about it to anybody. And he ended up being there 12 days. And on Friday, May 20th, my mom had asked if any of us kids wanted to go see Dad. And I was the only one who said, sure. So my dad and my mom and I walked down the street to a pharmacy that had a little soda cafe in the back. And after some questions about how school, blah, 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 my mom turned to my dad and said something to the effect of, aren't there things you want Larry to hear? And so my dad very haltingly said, son, I'm a sick man. I don't know how long until I start feeling better. But in the interim, I need you to kind of be the man of the house and take care of mom and your brother and sister. And I just remember like being this kind of warm anxiety that sometimes you get when people are saying something that has that kind of gravitas. Anyway, the next day he was scheduled to come home for the first time on a day pass. And my siblings and I were coming home from religious school, Jewish religious school. And as we approached the house, we saw an ambulance and two police cars right in front of our house. And we also saw like neighborhood kids who I knew racing back and forth, neighbors gathering on people's lawns to kind of gossip, try to figure out what was going on. And we jumped out of the carpool and ran up to the door, and our mom Ruth appeared, clearly shaken, and basically just said, "Kids, I need you to go across the street and stay there until your aunt comes." And my sister said, "What's going on?" And my mother said, "Well, your father's had a horrible accident."
Oh.
And so we had this couple hours at my uncle's house, Uncle and Aunt's house. And then finally I saw my mom walking up the front with her two best friends anchoring her on either, like literally supporting her on either side. And she entered the house and said to my siblings and me, "Kids, I need to see you in the backyard." And we went back there and she drew us close and basically said, "Your father's dead." And 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 so your head goes through, as you might imagine, all kinds of different scenarios. Did he fall off a ladder, trying to help mom? Did he, whatever, choke him, whatever? I just couldn't figure it out. He had just turned 49 years old and he was in good physical health. Anyway, a little bit longer, I hear my uncle, who my dad was in practice with, on the phone to the Denver Post, the local newspaper. And I overhear him say, "Look, I know you're the reporter who writes the obituaries, and you ask your editor. He knows us. And I only have one favor to ask. Can you please leave out the fact that my brother committed suicide from the newspaper?" And then suddenly I understood what happened. So that was kind of the start of the situation. That was confusing, like a lot of trauma. Confusing, surreal, hard to accept, much less understand. And it was, and then anyway, the funeral was terrible. For the first time, I had to be a man because I was bar mitzvahed. I had to be part of the prayer service the night before the cemetery, and then at the cemetery, I had to recite the mourner's Kiddush. And then when we returned to school, I kind of felt like a pariah, like nobody would come up to me or anything. And one of my thoughts at the time was, I bet they think suicide is contagious. So anyway, yeah, it was hard. We had to, my mom had to sell a kind of a dream home that she and my dad had built, moved us into a very small condo. She went back to work, which she hadn't had to do for a while. All those kind of reorientation, the reality of a smaller family.
So, how did you start piecing this all together? And you now are you now have such resilience. You had it then too, but now you are, you see this from a different perspective, and there's so many aspects to this. How did your journey start?
In an odd way, it started the evening my mom came home, maybe a month or two after my dad died, after seeing a therapist. And, she gathered my siblings and I at the dinner table and said, kids, it's okay to be furious at Dad. He deserted us. It's okay to be mad at it and frustrated. You know, he left us in this horrible situation. And at that time, I just couldn't generate that. I kind of had the feeling that Dad was had to be in the throes of this kind of mental illness to do this, and that I mean, even though it sounds a little bit strange, that I kind of felt I couldn't take it personally.
Yeah.
And that actually kind of set a frame for me mentally, emotionally, that, allowed me probably 5 or 6 years later to write a pretty bad juvenile novel recapturing that time. And over the years, I've tried to rewrite that story and get it right. I've tried it as a journalistic piece. I tried it as a first-person narration, third-person narration. Tried it as a kind of creative nonfiction, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, I kind of realized it was a memoir. But it took me, and during this time, I also lived in New York, and I published some books and stuff. So I mean, I identified as a writer. So I kind of felt that was going to be my avenue. And this may sound weird, but I would never consider myself fortunate or lucky. But as you well know, given your podcast and the people you talk to, there's traumas all over the place. There's some things that one might think is traumatic, or other people kind of can rightfully say, get over it. And then there's like the worst possible trauma imaginable. And I would never put myself in that camp. So anyway, so I kind of took this as a kind of journalistic, novelistic mission to find out. And it had a lot of steps. With my mom's approval, I got hospitalization records that my dad was hospitalized 2 times before. Once before they married, and once when I was 10 years old. Knew nothing about it. And the hospitals were very reticent to release these records because they claimed patient confidentiality for a dead person, right? But they finally released them. So I had 3 sets of hospitalization records that I had to go through, and then I also just started interviewing anybody who knew my dad. And at the time, here I know I'm aging myself already, but I'll further age myself by saying I had a little cassette recorder, So I interviewed his brother. I interviewed my mom a bunch of times over the years. I interviewed relatives in Newark about him growing up there. I interviewed some cousins of his that I never met. I also, at 19, took a semester off, and I went to Europe, and I went to Trieste, Italy, where he was stationed as a medical army doctor after the war, and went to the DP camps, displaced person camps, which were, even though it was 1948-49, Holocaust survivors were still in these camps.
Yeah.
Years later. And I even went to this small town in what was then Soviet Union, his birthplace, thinking maybe the answer's here. And then once I was there, it was just, I felt no emotional affinity. I mean, I even found a Jewish cemetery, but I had no way of knowing if that was where ancestors were born. And I finally came to I kind of went one of these dub moments, but I would have had to find a Jew who had lived there for 60 years, who had survived pogroms, the Bolsheviks, the White Russians, the Nazis, Stalin, rampant anti-Semitism, who spoke English and knew my family. Talk about a long shot. But I did go to all that effort. So, along the way, I just always was picking up things from other people who knew him and talked to family friends. And so that was both a creative mission, but it also was, a healing mission. And, I probably rewrote the book once every decade. And then when I was 53, I had unexpected open heart surgery bypass. And so I kind of wove that into the story. And it wasn't a traumatic episode for me, but I swore to myself that I would not leave my wife a widow and my daughters fatherless, like what had happened to me. That was a big motivation for me to get well and recuperate. And then, roughly about 2 years ago, I kind of felt I solved it. I broke up the chronology. I used it a lot. I incorporated my dad's war letters on these hospital records and transcripts of some of these interviews and my own childhood memories and such. And I tried to get an agent in New York, and one agent loved it and said she was going to put the book up for auction, which sadly resulted in nobody being interested in it. And so one day I was out to lunch with a former workmate who started a small publishing company. And I told him the story, and he just said, "Oh, I want to publish your book." So here we are roughly a year later.
So, through piecing this all together, what did you discover about your dad and yourself?
Well, it's kind of a mixed thing about my dad. I've had more than one doctor tell me that they're surprised he lived as long as he did. Partly because of the depth he probably was bipolar, more depressive than manic, but because of the serious, the recurring illness, and the treatment back then was pretty primitive.
Yeah.
And also some of the hospital records dating back to when he was released from the Army reported an aberrant EEG that suggested that he had a temporal brain tumor in what was then an inoperative part of the brain. Right? So, and so I had to learn all about that. Anyway, I learned that my dad. It's kind of a platitude, but I think my dad did the best he could with what he had, who he was. I mean, he had a very traumatic childhood. He got severely injured as a 3-year-old. He was in his older brother's shoulders and going, on one of these storage ships to America, and there was a kind of a stampede, and he got injured there, and he was largely deserted during the Depression because my grandmother had to work and things of that nature. And then something happened overseas, and I don't know if it was this brain tumor acted up or it was him experienced a post-Holocaust Europe, but he definitely came home a changed person. And so I realized that I was lucky to have him, if only for 13 years. I mean, I had no complaints about him as a father. He was loving and kidded around and, never. I remember when I was probably no older than 11, 12 years old, he gave me permission to stay up way past my bedtime because the movie Judgment at Nuremberg was being shown on The Late Show on TV. So, I mean, he was like, he was kind of like that kind of person. He was a, man of the world, so to speak. So and I also have a lot of regret that he didn't live to see me grow up and meet my wife and granddaughters and just have time together. So I've always, and then for myself, it just reinforced my philosophy that life is precious. I've had to work for decades and shit like that, for my language. But, in the morning I walk out and we live in the foothills of Denver and I look around and I just feel, man, this is just great to be alive. And so I'm fortunate to have that I never really felt felt victimhood.
Yeah.
Though for some trauma and for certain individuals, I mean, I think victimhood is a totally reasonable response for a while. But at some point, if you're capable, it's good if you can move past it.
So how do you feel that you recovered from your trauma, or you got out of the victimhood, if you were ever there?
Well, I think I made a decision that I wasn't, it was kind of, I wasn't a victim. Uh, I think I decided that in my teens. I mean, it was nothing to write home about, but I never felt that this trauma was directed at me. And again, that's a big difference than a lot of people who clearly
Yeah.
have it directed right at them. Right? Um, and I just think, looking back, it probably wasn't until I married a wonderful woman, loving, and we had three wonderful daughters, all who now are in their 30s, and one just turned 40. To have that experience of a loving family, I think was an enormous gift to me. That also helped uh, me elevate, what had been kind of like adolescent cynicism and sarcasm and things like that. So I think I reached a true point of compassion towards my father and my mother, who had to obviously try to support him all these years emotionally. And then I think at some point, if you're wired in a certain way, you reach a lot of compassion towards yourself. Um, and anybody involved in this story, I felt compassion for, even people who might have been able to help my dad but didn't. Um, certainly towards my sister and brother, enormous compassion. They were there. They had their own experience, their own trauma. So I kind of think that's what. Um, it didn't take me till my ripe old age here of almost 72, right? You know, but I think it definitely took me having my own family to kind of feel that my life was around again.
And so you spoke about your when you finished your bar mitzvah and you went over to your dad. He had this look on his face, and you felt as though you had disappointed him. Once once you knew more of the full picture and you saw, what was going on, and that he even before he committed suicide, knowing that he was going into hospital to try and get help, did that change that moment for
Oh yeah,
you?
it explained it in the sense that there was no there
Yeah,
to quote Gertrude Stein, um, that 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 he was so trying so hard just to survive the bar mitzvah,
yeah,
psychologically survive that moment, not let on that anything was amiss. And he was surrounded by all his professional colleagues, dear friends, relatives who and flew in from out of town. I mean, the pressure on him that weekend had to be monumental.
yeah,
So when I look back on that now, and there's this moment in the book where again, this is long before iPhones, but you'd have to send film out to the drugstore and then wait a couple of weeks and get the photos back. And I came home one afternoon and my mother had this folder of pictures from the bar mitzvah, and you can just see. I don't want to say he was emotionally dead looking, because clearly he wasn't, but you can look at him and wonder, why did people, you know, who he had friends who were psychiatrists, why weren't people helping him?
yeah.
So clear from these photos that he was suffering. Um, so Yeah, I mean, it's just one of those moments. I mean, it's just one of those things that's indelible. And I think that's one of the things about trauma that I'm sure, you've talked about is, there are certain sensations. They may be tactile, they may be, an image, they may be auditory, but, it's like post-traumatic, right?
Yeah.
I think people that have gone through a serious trauma, this stuff never leaves them, and is easily triggered.
Yeah.
But I still get triggered. There's times where I'll be watching a show and there's a suicide in it, and my wife will say, "I'm so sorry. If I had known that, we would have watched something else." And actually, it didn't really bother me at this point.
Yeah.
But there's still a lot of visual triggers and things like that. So anyway,
So for someone who is experiencing loss or trauma, what would you recommend that they do right that as their next thing to trying to overcome this?
well, I think there's kind of two paths. One is a healing path that may typically be involve some therapy, and often it's finding the correct therapist. uh, Luckily, I was kind of a creative kid. I wasn't an athlete. Um, and so I kind of always was drawing as a kid and stuff like that. So I did have this creative outlet, which eventually became writing. Uh, and I think it's never too early to capture that. Keep a journal. Don't worry about what's coming out. Just you know, make a record for yourself. Not to perhaps to check your healing progress, if that makes sense to you.
Yeah.
But also just to have it out, you know. And um, so, I would say, for me, it was the creative arts.
Mm.
And maybe I'm kidding myself, but there's a part of me that believes that if my dad had lived, that I wouldn't have gone into the creative arts. But that released me in odd ways. It released me from having to become a doctor. Like there was kind of doctors
Yeah.
all up and down my family. Right, my brother's a doctor, he's a pediatrician. It released me from becoming some kind of quote professional. Lawyer or something like that. So I kind of felt like there was nothing to lose after that, and then I had enough ego that that I could have be convinced that I was going to have a creative life. And that's been enormously satisfying too.
So there is my final question. Is there anything on your heart that you want to share that I haven't asked you about yet?
No, not really. Not really. I think trauma is a curious thing. It's probably one of the most isolating events that can happen to a person, and yet you're not going to heal from it if you don't reach out and accept love from other people and understanding and all that kind of stuff. So I guess I'd leave you with that.
Well, Larry, thank you so much for sharing your story and being with us today on Trauma Undone. Appreciate it.
Well, it's a pleasure. You take care.